I never thought I'd see the day my own parents would throw me and my 92-year-old grandfather out onto the street in the freezing cold, let alone on Christmas Eve, while the rest of our family sat inside eating a roast dinner. They stood on the porch, wrapped in their expensive designer sweaters, watching my grandfather tremble in his wheelchair as they told us we were no longer welcome in their home or their lives because we were ruining the holiday spirit. It was the ultimate betrayal from the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally, a cruel and heartless act driven entirely by greed, selfishness, and a complete lack of empathy. But as we sat in my old, broken-down car with the heater barely working, listening to the muffled sound of Christmas carols drifting from their locked front door, I made a promise to myself and to the fragile old man beside me that they would pay for what they did. Looking back at everything that unfolded next, the way a hidden truth tore our family apart and completely rewritten all our futures, I still wonder if the revenge that followed was too harsh, or if it was exactly what they deserved. Was I wrong for dismantling their lives piece by piece after they left us to freeze? Or would you have done the exact same thing to protect the only person who ever truly cared about you? To really understand how we ended up on that snowy driveway on the most joyful night of the year, you have to understand the dynamic of my family, which was built entirely on a foundation of shallow appearances, status, and material wealth. My parents, Richard and Alina, were obsessed with how they looked to the outside world, spending every dime they made on a massive suburban house, luxury cars they could barely afford, and throwing lavish parties to impress neighbors they didn't even like. I was always the black sheep of the family because I didn't care about any of that. I was working 2 jobs just to pay my way through a modest state college and preferred spending my weekends volunteering or just sitting quietly with my grandfather, Arthur. Grandpa Arthur was my mother's father, a fiercely independent, quiet, and deeply kind man who had spent his entire life working as a master carpenter, building a modest life through sheer hard labor and dedication. Tragically, a few years prior, my grandmother passed away, and shortly after, Arthur's health began a steep decline, culminating in a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed on his left side and confined to a wheelchair. Because my mother was his only living child, it was decided that he would move into our house, but my parents didn't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because they assumed Arthur had a massive life savings accumulated from decades of smart, frugal living and owning a valuable piece of historic land downtown. From the very moment he moved into the guest room on the ground floor, my parents treated him less like a beloved family member and more like an annoying, inconvenient tenant who owed them a debt, constantly dropping passive-aggressive hints about how expensive his medical supplies were and how much energy it took to accommodate his dietary restrictions. As the months went on, the responsibility of actually caring for Grandpa Arthur fell entirely on my shoulders, as my parents were always too busy attending charity galas, shopping, or working late to bother checking on him. I became his primary caregiver, waking up early to help him get dressed, preparing his meals, driving him to his physical therapy appointments, and staying up late into the night listening to his incredible stories about the old days, his time in the military, and how much he missed my grandmother. We developed an unbreakable bond, and he became more of a parent to me than Richard and Alina ever were, teaching me about integrity, humility, and what it truly means to be a good person. My parents, meanwhile, grew increasingly resentful of his presence as his medical needs increased, particularly my mother, who seemed disgusted by the physical realities of aging and viewed her own father's illness as a personal embarrassment that ruined the aesthetic of her perfect home. They would leave him alone in his room for days at a time when I wasn't around, refusing to bring him out when guests came over because his slurred speech and wheelchair didn't fit into the high society image they worked so hard to project. The tension in the house reached a boiling point during the holiday season, a time when my parents always went completely overboard with decorations and catering to throw their annual, massive Christmas Eve dinner party for all their wealthy friends and corporate executives. This year was supposed to be their biggest event yet, and for weeks, my mother had been stressed out of her mind, screaming at contractors, decorators, and me over the slightest imperfections. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Grandpa Arthur woke up feeling exceptionally weak and confused. a common side effect of a new medication his doctor had prescribed, and he accidentally knocked over a glass of cranberry juice on the expensive, white wool rug in the hallway outside his room. When my mother saw the stain, she absolutely lost her mind, screaming at the top of her lungs, calling him a clumsy, useless old man, and accusing him of trying to sabotage her party on purpose. I immediately stepped in, pulling my mother away and telling her she was being monstrous, which only redirected her fury toward me, as she shouted that I was an ungrateful loser who always took his side against my own flesh and blood. She ordered me to clean up the mess and keep Arthur locked away in his room for the rest of the day, demanding that he not show his face or make a single sound while her guests were in the house. My father backed her up completely, coldly stating that they couldn't have an invalid dragging down the energy of a holiday celebration, and that we both needed to know our place. I spent the afternoon cleaning the rug, comforting a weeping, deeply humiliated Grandpa Arthur, and trying to assure him that he was loved and wanted, even if his own daughter couldn't see his worth. By the time the evening arrived, the house was packed with dozens of wealthy, laughing guests in formal wear. Champagne was flowing, and loud music filled the air while Grandpa Arthur and I sat quietly in his dark room, sharing a simple plate of sandwiches I had smuggled in earlier. Around 9 in the evening, Arthur needed to use the restroom, but the specialized grip bars in his bathroom had loosened, so I had to help him navigate out into the main hallway to use the guest bathroom near the living room. As I was carefully wheeling him down the hall, his foot accidentally caught on the edge of a massive, heavy ice sculpture my parents had rented, causing it to wobble and crash hard against the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces and sending freezing water everywhere. The entire party fell dead silent as my mother sprinted over, her face twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated rage that I will never forget as she looked at the ruined centerpiece and the puddles spreading across her hardwood floors. She didn't care that Arthur was trembling from the shock of the noise, or that he was desperately trying to apologize through his tears. She just snapped, screaming that she was completely done with him, done with his mess, and done with me always enabling him. My father rushed over, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair and violently pushing Arthur toward the front door, while my mother grabbed my winter coat from the closet and threw it at my face, telling us both to get the hell out of her house right now. I pleaded with them, pointing out that it was freezing outside, that it was literally Christmas Eve, and that Arthur didn't have his proper medication or a warm coat, but my parents were completely blinded by their superficial anger and social embarrassment. They pushed us out onto the porch, slammed the heavy oak door shut, and turned the deadbolt, leaving us standing there in the falling snow while their guests watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence through the frosted glass windows. So that's the horrific situation I found myself in on Christmas Eve, standing in a freezing driveway with a crying, terrified 92-year-old man, locked out by my own parents who cared more about a broken ice sculpture than human life. I had to make a choice right then, and they're about how to survive the night and how to handle a family that had completely abandoned all basic human decency. Before I tell you the absolutely insane secret my grandfather revealed to me in the car next, and how it completely destroyed my parents' lives forever, I want you to pause, go down to the comments section right now, and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have begged them to let you back in, called the police on your own family, or taken matters into your own hands like I did? With my hands shaking from anger and the biting cold, I carefully lifted Grandpa Arthur into the passenger seat of my old sedan, folded his wheelchair into the trunk, and turned the heater on full blast, wrapping him in an old fleece blanket I kept in the backseat. He was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking as he looked back at the glowing, warm house where his own daughter was currently laughing and drinking with strangers, having completely discarded him like a piece of trash. I drove us to a cheap, 24-hour diner down the highway just to get some hot coffee and food into our systems, sitting in a vinyl booth under the harsh fluorescent lights while the snow piled up outside on the empty roads. As I sat there trying to figure out how I was going to afford a motel room for the night and where we would live moving forward, Grandpa Arthur reached across the table, grabbed my hand with a surprising amount of strength, and told me to stop worrying. He looked me dead in the eyes, his voice suddenly clear and completely devoid of the confusion he had shown earlier, and told me that he had been playing a part for a very long time to see who his family really was. He revealed to me that he wasn't broke at all. In fact, decades ago, he had quietly invested the proceeds from his carpentry business into prime real estate and commercial properties, and the downtown land my parents thought was worth a few $100,000 was actually worth millions because a massive tech corporation had been trying to buy it from him for years. He told me that he had kept his immense wealth completely secret from my mother and father because he always suspected they were greedy, shallow people who only cared about money, and their behavior over the last year had proven his worst fears entirely correct. Arthur then smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and told me that he had already updated his legal will and testament with his attorney a week prior, ensuring that my parents would never see a single cent of his fortune, and that everything, the land, the millions in investments, and his secret bank accounts, was being left entirely to me. But he didn't want to wait until he passed away to teach them a lesson. He wanted to execute his revenge immediately, and he asked me if I was willing to help him completely dismantle the comfortable, arrogant life my parents had built on the backs of others. The next morning, on Christmas Day, while my parents were likely opening their expensive gifts and pretending we didn't exist, I drove Grandpa Arthur straight to a luxury extended-stay hotel, paying for a beautiful, fully accessible suite using a black credit card he pulled from a hidden compartment in his old leather wallet. Over the next week, Arthur and I worked closely with his high-powered corporate attorney to initiate a series of legal and financial maneuvers that would completely catch my parents off guard. It turned out that the massive suburban house my parents lived in was actually built on a large parcel of land that Arthur had technically owned and permitted them to use decades ago through a complex family trust. A trust that gave Arthur the absolute right to revoke their occupancy at any time if he chose to liquidate the asset. Furthermore, my father's struggling boutique consulting firm had recently taken out a massive, private bridge loan to stay afloat during a bad fiscal year. And through a series of shell companies, Grandpa Arthur's investment portfolio happened to be the primary backer and owner of that exact debt. We held all the cards, and my parents had absolutely no idea that the old man they had thrown out into the snow like garbage was actually the sole landlord of their home and the primary creditor of their entire livelihood. On the first business day after New Year's, we struck back with full force, delivering a series of legal notices that completely shattered my parents' manufactured reality. First, my mother received a formal, court-ordered eviction notice from Arthur's estate lawyers, informing her that the family trust was being dissolved and that she and Richard had exactly 30 days to completely vacate the property before the house was put on the market for demolition and redevelopment. Total panic set in for them, and my phone immediately began blowing up with dozens of frantic calls and texts from my mother, going from furious demands to hysterical sobbing, begging me to tell her where Grandpa was, and claiming that the eviction had to be a massive clerical mistake. I ignored every single one of her messages, letting the dread cook in their minds as they realized their dream home was being taken away from them. The very next day, my father went to his corporate office only to be met by a team of forensic accountants and legal representatives representing Grandpa's investment firm, who informed him that his business loan was being called in immediately due to a strict breach of financial covenants regarding his company's hidden debts. Because my father had foolishly used their personal assets and luxury cars as collateral for the business loan, the firm immediately began the legal process of seizing his vehicles, freezing his commercial accounts, and stripping him of his corporate status. Within 48 hours, the wealthy, high-society lifestyle Richard and Alina had spent their entire lives lying and stepping on people to maintain was completely brought to its knees, all directed by the quiet old man they thought was helpless. The climax of this entire saga happened 2 weeks later, when my parents, desperate, broke, and facing total ruin, managed to track down the location of our luxury hotel's suite and showed up at our door, looking absolutely pathetic, exhausted, and completely stripped of their former arrogance. Gone were the designer clothes and the smug, superior attitudes. My mother was wearing a faded sweatshirt, her eyes red and puffy from crying, while my father stood behind her looking defeated, holding a folder full of financial documents. They literally fell to their knees in the hallway begging Grandpa Arthur for forgiveness, crying about how stressed they had been during the holidays, and claiming that throwing us out was a horrible mistake that they regretted every single second since it happened. They begged me to talk to Arthur, pleading with me as their child to save them from homelessness and bankruptcy, promising that if we dropped the lawsuits and stopped the foreclosure, they would give us the biggest rooms in the house and take care of Grandpa for the rest of his days. Grandpa Arthur sat in his wheelchair, looking down at his sobbing daughter with an expression of cold, detached pity, before telling them that they weren't sorry for what they did to him. They were only sorry that they finally got caught playing a game with someone who held all the pieces. He told them that on Christmas Eve, they had shown the world exactly who they were, and that a mother who would leave her own son and elderly father to freeze in the dark didn't deserve a home, a business, or a family. I looked my parents in the eye and told them that they were completely dead to me, and that the only reason I was glad they threw us out was because it finally opened my eyes to the monsters they truly were. I then closed the heavy hotel door in their faces, locking it securely just as they had done to us, while they wept and pounded on the wood from the outside, realizing that no one was coming to save them. The aftermath of that confrontation was swift, brutal, and completely absolute for everyone involved in this family tragedy. My parents were legally forced out of their massive suburban home a couple of weeks later, and because they had absolutely no money left to their name, and their credit was entirely destroyed by the business foreclosure, they were forced to move into a tiny, cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the poorest side of the city. My father's business went completely under, forcing him to take a low-paying, entry-level job at a local retail store just to pay rent, while my mother, who had never worked a day in her life, had to take a job cleaning houses for the very high-society neighbors she used to look down upon. They tried to sue Grandpa Arthur and me multiple times to contest the trust dissolution and the will, but every single judge threw their cases out of court within minutes, citing the ironclad legality of Arthur's financial moves and their own documented history of elder neglect. As for Grandpa Arthur and me, we bought a beautiful, spacious ranch-style home in a quiet, sunny coastal town, completely retrofitted with top-of-the-line medical equipment, and a beautiful woodworking shop where he spent his final years teaching me his craft in absolute peace and comfort. He passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, surrounded by love, dignity, and comfort, knowing that he had protected the only person who loved him for who he was, and leaving his entire multi-million-dollar estate to me, ensuring I would never have to struggle a day in my life again. Looking back on this entire wild journey, from the freezing driveway on Christmas Eve to inheriting a fortune I never expected, I've learned that true family isn't defined by blood, status, or the appearances you put on for the rest of the world. It's defined by the love, respect, and loyalty you show to one another when the cameras are off and no one else is watching, and those who choose greed and cruelty will always eventually reap exactly what they sow. If there's one lesson you take away from my story, let it be to always cherish and protect the elderly and vulnerable in your life, because you never truly know the depth of their wisdom, their strength, or the secrets they might be holding. Thank you so much for sitting down and listening to my story today, and if you believe that my parents got exactly what they deserved for their cruelty, please hit that like button right now to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking, dramatic, and emotional real-life stories just like this one every single week, and make sure to share your final thoughts on this whole crazy mess in the comments section down below. I really want to know if you think my revenge went too far, or if it was the perfect Christmas miracle, and I'll see you all in the next story.